Thank you very much, Dr. Jethro, for inviting me to be here today. I wish I could be with you in Cape Town in person, but the situation is such that you will get to see a 2D image of me and me of you. And a big thank you to all of the attendees for taking the time away from your busy schedules to hear me talk. My talk about Gustav Fritsch will last around 35 minutes, after which I'm really looking forward to your questions. And thank you, Dwayne, for changing the slides since you have access to my presentation and not me. It is difficult, if not impossible, to extract and preserve fresh eyeballs within 1 hour after death, especially considering the strict adherence to legal regulations that make gaining the material almost entirely out of the question in some countries. In other countries, it is only through the lenient operation of the law or through the inconsiderate bypassing of said laws that such an endeavor would be at all doable. Gustav Fritsch was the right man to overcome these difficulties. In Australia, he reached his goal despite strict legal resolutions. The resistance he overcame was so massive, and the law had to be perverted so much so that he did not even dare name the names of his accomplices in order not to harm them. His elevated and purely scientific goal justified in this rare case the means he used. This paragraph is taken out of the obituary of comparative anatomy professor, anthropologist, and photographer Gustav Fritsch. Slide, please. It was written by his former student, Graf Haller, in 1927. Haller, who refers to Fritsch as a good German, ein guter Deutscher, congratulates him on weaving an international web of violence and deceit that is responsible for the illegal transport of around 60 human eyeballs, which Fritsch termed racial eyes, Rassenaugen, from several parts of the world, including Australia, several countries in Africa, and Europe. This endeavor was largely financed by the Berlin Academy of Science, today at Jägerstraße 22. By the time of his death, Fritsch had long been a household name in a variety of disciplines, which is why my introduction here will survey the breadth of his scientific inquiries throughout his life. Despite the scope and the longevity of his work, the current scholarship about Fritsch stops at the end of the 19th century. In doing so, it neglects his subsequent and arguably more perplexing and even arcane articulations of race photography and color technology in the early 20th century and until his death, which I will be addressing today. Slide, please. In 1870, with neurologist Edward Hitzig, Fritsch electrically stimulated the motor cortex of mostly unanesthetized dogs. And this stimulation caused movements in their muscles, thereby localizing certain functions of the body in the brain, and was recognized as a breakthrough experiment in neurology. Fritsch also extensively theorized about photography, most notably in Georg von Neumayer's foundational book from 1875, Anleitung zu wissenschaftlichen Beobachtungen auf Reisen, the guidebook of scientific observation while on voyage. In his chapter in Neumeyer's book, he pins down the use of the camera as a scientific instrument for the construction of otherness, which anthropology has long traded in. Moreover, he used the medium of photography in his study of the anatomy and physiology of the peoples of South Africa, which he visited from 1863 to 1866, producing images that circulated far and wide in the German Empire and beyond it well into the 20th century. Between his extensive travels in 1904 and 1905, which I am still mapping, but I know that he was in Australia, for example, at the time, he found enough internal space and just flexibility to write articles about how the Jewish race stems from ancient Egyptians seen on monuments, texts on how racial intermingling will be the downfall of humankind, and articles about the study of skin color and standardized color charts. Slide, please. So, in Fritsch's life, the overlap between his anthropological and photographic endeavors could not have been clearer than in him having co-founded both the Berlin Anthropological Society, the Berliner Gesellschaft für Anthropologie, Ethnologie und Urgeschichte, as well as the Free Photographic Union of Berlin, the Freie Fotografische Vereinigung zu Berlin. These two institutions together were responsible for the use of scientific photography, to which anthropological photography belongs, and for its dissemination to broader audiences in the capital and beyond it. This dissemination took place through image reproduction, projection of images on glass slides, critique of image making in photographic journals, etc., all of which Fritsch supported and participated in until the end of his life. Shortly before his death, Fritsch relied on human remains to investigate the constitution, appearance, color, and texture of hair and of the scalp of several individuals, many from South Africa, but not only. I was wondering if he was in Lebanon because he was in Yemen and he was in Egypt, but this part of his work remains unclear, so I'm still working on it. He photographed and represented hair and the scalp as racial markers in several publications, such as Über die Ausbildung der Rassenmerkmale des menschlichen Haupthaares, 1896, also financed by the Berlin Academy of Science, and Das Haupthaar und seine Bildungsstätte, which was apparently a blockbuster, having been published in 1912 and republished until 1915, and well quoted and used after the end of the empire. So it is only, in my opinion, when we focus as well on Fritsch's research in the 20th century and not only in the 19th, along with his various political ties, will we fully understand his influence on other major racial hygienists, such as Eugen Fischer, whose role in the mass violence of Nazi Germany cannot be overstated. So it is important to examine Fritsch's reception after his death because most of his books were well cited at least until the 1950s. So what is at stake in investigating Fritsch today is the understanding how racial theory crosses through the history of the German Empire, the Weimar Republic, and Nazi Germany as a red thread as it changes form. Within the landscape of various anatomical and racial inquiries, Fritsch's study of human and animal eyeballs around 1900 tied together his biological, anthropological, colonial, and photographic strands of research. Slide, please. He delineated a part of the eyeball's anatomy that was previously unmapped in Western European science, the aria centralis and the fovea centralis that are present in the retina of some animals and human beings, respectively, and are responsible for high-resolution binocular vision. He thought he could get the Nobel Prize for this, but that didn't happen. Slide, please. Joining anthropologist Paul Broca in France and doctor of medicine and founder of physical anthropology, Rudolf Virchow in Berlin, who were also studying eyeballs, Together, they sought exact criteria for racial comparisons that were integral to the method of German anthropology, which considered itself a natural science, not a humanist science, studying what it derogatorily referred to as natural people. So each in their way, Fritsch and his colleagues traced through the eye's structure, color of the iris, shape, and its performance, the alleged existence of different types of people across geographies. These various inquiries were crucial to Fritsch's interdisciplinary conception of the organization of the visual system in living beings and in three-color photography. Unlike usual research about Fritsch, I will be dealing not with his black and white images from the 1860s, but with his writings on and his use of three-color photography. Today, I will be presenting you the way in which Fritsch understood the concept of nature in relation to color photography. And most importantly, what did this concept actually legitimize? My contention is that Fritsch used the pretext of researching three-color photography, which during his time was a crucial technology of empire that was expanding, to do colonial science on human remains. And he masked his actual research project on comparative anatomy across the races with a bewildering understanding of nature, color, and the camera. Slide, please. So I will start by explaining three colors to you a bit briefly. So an object is recorded when the light that hits it goes through three color filters, red, green, blue, that are in the camera. And so these filters inside of the camera are treated with a variety of chemicals to make them color sensitive to blue rays, to green rays, to red rays. And then once the light ray goes through the filter, it continues and then hits the actual photosensitive glass plate. And so what happens is that the color is analyzed, it is split into these three different colors, red, green, blue, which you see in front of you. And if you want to restore the colors, to mix all the colors again, you have to take the three color separation negatives, turn them into a positive, so it's the positive negative system, and then you can project them. Around 1900, it was put into, the three glass plates were put into a special projector, and when they were projected, you would see a color image. Otherwise, they look black and white. Today, people do a digital reconstruction. Now, if you want to have color on paper, you will take the glass negative, and through a chromogenic print, you can print the full color image on paper. So just to make it a bit easier, this is how your television at home manages to give you projected color, and how the printer in your office works. Like you have various containers with pigments in them, like usually 3 plus black. And out of these three colors, the printer can give you all the other colors you need to print a photograph. So it's still based, technology today is still based on this three color principle. Slide, please. In the German Empire, this color technology is mostly associated with photochemist and photographer Adolf Miete. Adolf Miete's success was sweeping and widespread. He hit gold in 1904 with the first color photography book, the Stolwerk album number 7, which uses three color photography on paper. He also designed cameras and various other photographic equipment, which earned him a lot of money. Fritsch's research about three-color photography in the early 20th century was financed by AGFA, the Aktiengesellschaft für Anilinfabrikation, the German chemical industry giant that had, around 1900, the biggest financial success of its history, providing circa 90% of the world's demand for synthetic dyestuff. Hence, given three-color photography's reliance on dyestuff and chemicals, as we saw with the camera filters, its main practitioners and photographers could and did align themselves with the chemical industry's image as, I quote, a future technology, a Zukunftstechnologie, in the words of Arne Andersen. This Zukunftstechnologie also went hand in hand with nationalism. Never has this been more evident than in Adolf Miete's speech given at Kaiser Wilhelm II's birthday in 1905, titled The Historical Development of Color Photography, in which Miete heralded three-color photography as, I quote, a building block in the mighty tower of our German spiritual culture, end quote. So between the chemical industry's economic boom and Adolf Miete's increasing paycheck, it could not have escaped Fritsch that there was clearly money to be made in the field of color photography and money to be given for doing research about it. Paid for by ACFA, when studying vision, Fritsch fetishized the eye. He thought that for color photography to be able to reproduce the colors of the world, it has to operate like a living eye on the most minute of levels, in its anatomy and in its neurology. So the camera is not like an eye on a metaphorical level, it should be an eye. Anatomically, Fritsch saw in the structure of the retina of animals and humans, whose native country he doesn't specify in this context, what he calls the material basis, materiellen Unterlagen, of three-color photography. It is a correspondence between the biological organ and the mechanical camera that he finds when looking at these eyes. How? He considers that this correspondence was given to the scientist by nature itself. In fact, mimicking the biological structure and the internal mechanism of the eye was essential for developing this color technology à la Fritsch. Yet, the eye's biological structure existed on a scale so small that it was itself beyond the purview of vision. So how could Fritsch study something like the anatomy of the eye that is so minute, taking place on the smallest of scales in a fragile organ? In order to access this scale, Fritsch relied on histology, histology being the microscopic study of tissue, and photomicrography, which is the use of a microscope with a camera attached to it to take an image of the specimens you're looking at, two fields which you already excelled at. Slide, please. Having dissected his fair share of eyeballs, Fritsch examined the interaction between the two layers of the retina, the highly pigmented layer, which contains red, green, and blue pigments, and the neural layer, specifically its photoreceptors, the rods and the cones, which you see here, which capture light and make human beings capable of seeing color. So for him, in order to make the camera capable of capturing the color red, which was notoriously difficult, camera filters had to have the exact color of the actual photoreceptors of the retina of human beings. Why? Because to him, I quote, color photography teaches us that nature, by its own accord, selbsttätig, has created facilities, Einrichtungen, which we have only recently laboriously acquired in the technical field, end quote. Thus insisting that nature has locked some technological secret in eyeballs of humans and animals. So Fritsch experimented with various dye stuff for camera filters for 3-color photography with the hope of mimicking the elusive color of photoreceptors. So he settled finally on a dye stuff called Congo Red, Congo Rot. Congo Red was created in 1883 by chemist Paul Bottega. And pretty much when he first created it, no one was interested until 1885, Agfa buys Congo Red and starts selling it to the textile industry and made a lot of money from it. So the thing is, this was unfolding at the time when the Berlin Africa Conference was taking place, which marks the official start of German colonialism, whereas colonial relations of exploitation and colonial fantasies existed before it and continued to exist after it. So Agfa, like a lot of chemical companies at the time, were using this image of exoticism and taking advantage of colonialism and the entire imaginary around it to sell products better. Thus, Congo Red, it has nothing to do with Congo, was made by a white German in a laboratory. Moreover, during his work on human remains, and while writing his article about the presumed visual acuity of the different races, titled Rassenunterschiede der menschlichen Netzhaut, Fritsch uncovered another correspondence between 3-color photography and the eye. And this correspondence was visual red, the Seerot. Visual red is the color of the retina itself, which you see here in front of you. And Fritsch, he compared it to ethyl red, which is a chemical substance used for photographic sensitization, which is very much needed for 3-color photography, and without which color photography would not exist at all. And this substance was used extensively by the person behind 3-color photography, Adolf Miete, and it was largely associated to him. And what is really interesting here is that the laboratory where Miete worked and he himself had already a patent for ethyl red in 1902. And Fritsch was writing about its importance in 1904. So something doesn't add up. Having unlocked these correspondences between the red color of the photoreceptor and Congo Red, and between the visual red of the retina and another photographic sensitization substance, Fritsch produced, slide please. Fritsch produced, a 3-color photomicrograph of the pigeon's retina in 1904. And please beware that the next slide is an image of animal remains. So if you're, slide please. So this is a 3-color photomicrograph on paper of the pigeon's retina taken in 1904. It features the peripheral part of the area centralis and the photoreceptors, which you see here. So you have the red photoreceptors, like the red dots, and you have the yellow photoreceptors, and the green-blue ones are severely underexposed, but they're there. And this image was magnified linearly by 780 times. So it's a photomicrograph camera through a microscope. Yet, the technical complexity of this image was not enough to wow the photographic community at the time, who barely took notice of it and of Fritsch's work, although he was pretty famous in the photographic scene. A commentator in the journal Photographische Rundschau, the most important of its time, merely called this image and Fritsch's dabbling with 3-color photography, I quote, "a strange fact, eine merkwürdige Tatsache," end quote. So we're at this point where Fritsch uncovers a proximity between the eye and the camera, alleging the existence of secrets nature hid in biology in 1904. Whereas the photochemists behind this sensitizing material figured it out in 1902, as I told you, so 2 years before Fritsch's article. So people already knew this. Also, his use of Congo red and other dye stuff for camera filters is no doubt interesting if you really want to sensitize your filters. But it appears that nobody in the photographic community cared enough to review his work at a time when literally everything about color photography was being scrutinized, discussed, taken apart, criticized, everything. No one cared. And Fritsch overall doesn't reveal anything in his research and images using 3-color photography that photographers didn't know already. And he doesn't seem to have impressed anyone in any way, shape, or form. So what kind of knowledge, if any, was Fritsch generating in this case? In fact, his idea about nature locking some secret in 3-color photography was not conducive to him doing any groundbreaking work. It merely allowed him to employ increasingly invasive methods to dissect human and animal remains. He used the ongoing hype around 3-color photography to propel his microscopic examination of eyeballs and of race. This examination culminated in his magnus opus of racism, one of many, which is his 1908 book Über Bau und Bedeutung der Aria Centralis des Menschen, in which he compares the, I quote, constitution and meaning of the Aria Centralis in people, end quote, by studying human eyeballs from individuals from Egypt, Sudan, East and South Africa, China, India, Europe. The violent black and white images in this book, which I will not be showing you out of concern for their brutal history, explode the notion of the racial type. The racial type, which is often considered to be a photograph of a person with a human face and a body, known to us from Fritsch's photographs and also the work of various other anthropologists, disappears. Or better yet, it changes scale. Fritsch's racial types in 1908 are a mere organ, an eye, shaped as a circle, looking gray, floating against a black background. It's a microscopic specimen. It's a human tissue and not the actual human. So unless you know what it is, when you go through this book, it could be anything. Like it could be an image of the moon. It's a gray circle against a black background. So what is there to indicate it's racial or it's not racial? The only indication for that is often a caption at the bottom of the image, which says, for example, Egyptian North Africa. So the racial type itself becomes more of a caption and less of an image because there is nothing discernible in the image itself unless you're a trained doctor. Now, all this is not to say that Gustav Fritsch did not care about 3-color photography, because he was definitely interested, just not as much as publications about it seem to suggest, as his publications about color seems to suggest. Still, he took part in 3-color photography's most representative project, a color photography book series called World in Color, Welt in Farbe, by publisher Karl Weller. Slide, please. Fritsch wrote the introduction to one of Weller's most representative photo books, Die Deutschen Kolonien, published in 1909-1910, and republished again and again in the Weimar Republic and in Nazi Germany. So he emerged at the turn of the last century as a flexible figure servicing several audiences: anthropologists, biologists, amateur photographers, and of course the German mid-upper class, the Mittelstände, who could afford Die Deutschen Kolonien's whopping price of 200 marks. So almost half half the average yearly salary. And Fritsch had to write texts in a way that the Mittelstände could actually read and understand, because his scientific publications are unreadable. So Fritsch's intro to the book, the one from 1910, starts with a quote by Heinrich Heine and ends with a quote by Goethe. And in it, he positions three-color photography as the romantic medium through which nature can clone its own image. Through color photography, landscapes, slide please, which are the only photos he talks about in the book, can vehicle Natur Wahrheit, truth to nature. And so here, what I will be doing is to show you some photographs from the book taken by its photographer, Robert Lohmeyer, who was an expert on three-color photography, and he trained in Berlin with Adolf Miete, so the big name scientist behind it. Still, having done enough research about landscape photography, the colonial landscapes present the colonies of the German Empire as a place that has no people, and it has no inhabitants. And it can be claimed and reclaimed by the empire at will, because there isn't really anyone there to resist. This is the visual narrative that colonial photography tries to articulate when it comes to landscape. And so in order to criticize this and to deconstruct my own use of these images in this presentation, I will be confronting them with archival material from the Ethnologisches Museum's collection, the Robert Lohmeyer collection, in order to reveal how these images can also tell a different story. I also have a story about them, but I will leave it at the end. Slide, please. So Fritsch, in his introduction, constructed a teleological characteristic parallels between three-color photography and Africa as a colonized continent, undifferentiated, with everyone and everything lumped together. He calls them the eigentümliche Parallele. He claimed that both color photography and Africa stem from the same soil, and both of them try with faltering steps to reach a higher level of sophistication. And both of them require victims. Three-color photography demands a human cost, because think of all these poor white scientists sacrificing their time and energy to create it. So the notion of the victims of color underpinning Fritsch's statement is borrowed from the chemical industry's various attempts at accounting for the environmental and human damage it caused and was perpetuating en masse at the time. As soon as explosions or the poisoning of rivers were kept under control or under the table, the chronic illness and the steady death tolls of workers in pigment and dyestuff manufacturing plants in the German Empire were easy to sweep under the rug by the likes of Aqua, financing Fritsch, that cared mostly about its market shares. So the victim of color, which he uses like, oh, three-color photography has its victims, it's not popping up out of nowhere. There was an entire discourse around, oh, you know, the color industry, but it's an industrial boom. Okay, workers died, we'll get other workers. So it's a very tricky thing that he's going through. A slide, please. Colonialism indeed had hundreds of thousands of victims, especially at the time Fritsch wrote this text, which was during or shortly after the Herero-Nama genocide of 1904-1908, in which Kurt Schwabe, this book's editor and Fritsch's son-in-law, was an active participant. But you wouldn't know it reading the publisher's promotional text for the book series. The publisher employs a vocabulary similar to Fritsch's, emphasizing how photography tries to capture nature, but renders it a lifeless form, leblose form, whereas color can best render the characteristic beauty of landscape, charakteristischen Darstellung landschaftliche Schönheit. And color lets nature express its temperament and its life. It gives the image a soul, a Seele. It creates a desire, a lust for it. And color landscape photography generates an increasing Lebenstrieb, a life force in German people to run to nature itself, propelling a strange hot nostalgia for it, merkwürdige heißen Sehnsucht nach der Natur, and a heartwarming mood, a warmherzige Stimmung, which will lead them to buying the book. So the text continues saying that the achievement of three-color photography is to force, I quote, force nature to print its own forms and to produce its colors by itself. Ihre Formen selbst abdrückte, auch ihre Farbe ebenso genau von selbst wiederzugeben, end quote. So it is thanks to three-color photography that nature can finally express its own unique character and temperament as it wishes to do so, creating its own self-portrait, Natur-Selbstbildnis. So what the combination of words and color images in Die Deutschen Kolonien does, in fact, is to eclipse the violence at the heart of the colonial project by presenting an image of what I like to call environmental safety. It is an image of the ongoing colonial project without violence, without war, without the military, and without anything that is not a German church or a clubhouse, Western European architecture. So these pictures in color appeared to the German upper class to carry a great deal of photographic objectivity and historical weight because three-color photography was framed as nature's own image, thus eclipsing the political reality of German colonialism. To conclude, the concept of nature in Gustav Fritsch's practice of and discourse about three-color photography had a variety of functions. It helped legitimize an ever-increasing violent intrusion on human and animal remains on the grounds of nature having locked some secrets in the histological structure of the retina. And these secrets that could be fruitful for technological development explained why he needed to keep dissecting these human remains. Also, the romanticism of nature cloning its own image in three-color photography in the book Die Deutschen Kolonien attempted to mask the sweeping extent of colonial violence that was unfolding at the time in favor of the illusion of peace and an empty land that can be claimed by the German Empire. As for the human remains I mentioned at the beginning, all the institutions I asked in Berlin about them have never heard of them, nor do they have them, or they don't say that they do. So this for me remains an open question that I'm still working on. Thank you. Slide, please.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, that was so rich, and it was so rich and a lot to think with. You raised a number of provocations about color, that color and technoscience and the use of photography in the German colonial context that touches on so many different areas. Now, I'm not a specialist of this period or of Gustav Fritsch, so my questions will be around the kinds of philosophical underpinnings that you're kind of getting at with some of the things that you raised in your talk. So I like this idea of color photography as producing nature in its own image in some sense, right? Like you empowered to render nature in its fullness. So I was wondering if you'd probed a little bit about what dominant concepts of nature were circulating at the time in Germany, and what this discourse of in nature's own image, what discourse it actually plugs into, and what threads actually come out of that, and how does that travel through other aesthetic disciplines, perhaps in fine art, for example. So I wondered about that. And then I really enjoyed your thinking and working through Gustav Fritzsch's reasoning around the anatomy of the eye. But there are two things. Firstly, it's his careful reasoning about the anatomy of the eye as something that should be reproduced in a camera form. But then you also tell us that, well, this research wasn't really so much about 3-color photography. It was also to do with him being able to legitimize his access to biological specimens, both human and animal. And you showed this beautiful image of the retina. I'll go, if you don't mind, I'll go back to the slide of the pigeon, of the retina of the pigeon as an illustration of this. That struck me because we are located near the company gardens, a site which is full of pigeons. So whenever I look at the pigeons in the company gardens, I'll always think of them differently. But so what I'm getting at here with your point about correspondences was that there's a philosophy of science that is percolating precisely there. And I was wondering if you could articulate that philosophy of science a little bit more clearly and precisely, because it is about the correspondence between the eye and the construction of the camera. But I think there's a deeper philosophy of what science actually is, that's occurring in that space of construction between approximation of the eye to the camera. That was the second point that struck me. So this philosophy of science of the eye, these concepts of nature that are circulating at that particular time also. And then the third philosophical strand that I wondered about was, and this comes out of our talk with Luisa Prado Martins, which we had recently. She talks about the colonial histories of color, and she unpacks these different strands and how different colors are related to different extractive regimes in different parts of the world, and how they bleed into all kinds of aesthetic practices. And I wondered if there wasn't a little bit of room in your thinking about Gustav Fritzsch for a kind of philosophy of color and the ways in which color work to mystify the operations of power that we see both in the construction of science and the extension of the German Empire. And it's not just at a rhetorical and discursive level in terms of the way in which certain colors were named, for example, like Congo, they'd be interested in that. But there's something about the aesthetic of the color that actually works to, for lack of a better word, to camouflage, to cloak, to cover up the operations of power in very interesting ways. And I wondered if you could push a little bit more the kinds of philosophies of a kind of philosophy of color that is percolating in Gustav. So those are the 3 points that came out for me.
Yes, so thank you very much for your comment. I will start by addressing this idea of nature cloning itself. The thing is, in photographic theory, this is not new, because with the disclosure of the daguerreotype, which is often considered to be the first photograph, this idea of nature drawing itself or printing itself or cloning itself has been part of the photographic discourse since 1838, 1839. So the fact that in color photography, several decades, almost a century later, this gets repeated is also a legitimization of color photography as its own medium, because it's taking this discourse familiar to monochrome photography and saying it's mine as well. So there is that part of it. And what strikes me about this nature claim in this case is that nature, 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 but color photography depended on so many machines that there was nothing at all spontaneous about it. Like the projector needed to project color weighed like 122 kilograms. It could explode at any moment. It risked overheating. The camera was very difficult to use. Like actually generating a color image was a challenge on both a philosophical level, because you had to get there in terms of thinking about how to split light rays and then how to mix them back together. And you had to get there on the technical level, because I mean, actually building a machine that can give you what you want. And you had to transport the equipment. There was nothing obvious about it. But in order to make it appealing to the German middle upper class that would buy these images or these color photography books, it needed, I think, this romantic glossing over the technical complexity. Because in fact, the technology was very unreliable. And what worked today didn't work tomorrow. So this idea of nature is both like has a commercial aspect to it, like it's to sell the product better, it's to couch it in terms that are more comfortable to hear, and of course it masks the kind of violence behind this entire endeavor of Fritsch. Now, as for Fritsch and the eye, the thing is, I mean, I kept going round and round with this research. The fact that he didn't need to get anywhere near human remains in order to reach the conclusions that he reached. It's just, it's not possible. What he wrote was already known, it was already done, it was already commercialized. So what is the point of this? And I kept thinking about it and feeling like, oh, but I missed something, but maybe. And in fact, no, I mean, it lasted for years when I'm researching this. And I think that the philosophy behind it, like, I'm not sure if I would call it philosophy. I think it's literally just an extractive logic. It's the fact that he knew, especially because he had worked with the industry before. He worked with Zeiss, developing microscopes, also with Robert Koch, whose experiments in East Africa are their own research topic. So he knew that he could get these funding if he would position himself as the scientist, the famous scientist, who has experience in the industry and who could theoretically at least innovate in the realm of technology. So his philosophy of the eye, stricto sensu in photography, is the extractive logic. Like, how do I get money to look into the microscopic structure? So once that was achieved, the amount, like the knowledge he produced about the eye when it comes to racial theory was nothing. Because with all of his publications about the eye, the shape, the size, the visual acuity, he never reached the conclusive ideas that he wanted to reach. There was nothing about the eye's performance, color, shape, size that could really indicate where the person came from. And the same thing for hair. The debates among anthropologists at the time, like, how do I know if the hair is curly, that it comes from Tanzania and not from Australia? Oh, you have to slice it in half and then look, but there was nothing conclusive about it. Like, if anthropologists were looking for a very distinct feature to determine race, like arguably color is the worst possible feature, is the worst possible makmal, because it is neither in the person, like it's neither in your eye, nor is it in the world, nor is it in the light entirely. It's projective, like it's between all of these dimensions. So limiting it and saying, okay, I'm gonna look into how perception on a physiological level works to determine one thing or another about race, it didn't work for him. So his results were inconclusive. And I like this because I feel like sometimes there is a risk of taking Fritsch too seriously with the knowledge that he produced, which is like reading the critique of people of his work on race and on photography puts everything in a different perspective that I'm very appreciative of. And when it comes to the colonial history of color, it's a very good question because it is often one that is associated to organic pigments that are taken, let's say, from certain vegetables, that are taken from minerals and then transformed. But we're talking here in the early 20th century about color entirely made in a laboratory environment. It didn't come from anywhere, like a physical country, like Congo taken from Congo. It was not. It was entirely made in a laboratory environment and still knee-deep in colonial history. So, or knee-deep in this colonial rhetoric of marketing, of exoticism, etc. So the color need not be extracted physically from one of the colonies of the German Empire for it to operate within the colonial discourse and within a colonial framework. Thank you.
Thanks, and I especially like this last point that you made about these colors as being synthetic. They were man-made entirely, and then you also in your presentation you made this remark about the victims of color as well, people who died in the process of actually the production, the industrial production of these colors. The other point that from your responses that also struck me was how you're making the proposition that, well, let's not take Gustav Fritsch too seriously. Like, let's not assume that he knew what he was doing and that his work was sterling. What if we sit with the assumption that, well, there were dubious ends behind this research in the very first place, that wasn't the real goal. And it's an interesting set of propositions to sit with, especially for the discipline of history, for example, when you often have to assume, and based on the work that is produced, that these are the lines in which a scholar should be appreciated. But if we change our assumptions about how texts work and the broader context in which a scientist is actually working, then it allows us to also to decenter these big figures in historical context, right? Like, so that we can undermine the authority in some way by bringing them under a different set of lenses. So that was really generative for me, and hopefully it's generative for our audience members who are patiently waiting. I would now like to open up for a round of questions. So for those of you that have questions, I see Michaela Clark has made a comment in the comment section about Silverman's interpretation of Art Nouveau whiplash designs at the Africa Museum in Belgium, that she argues through on the literal use of whips to look at rubber bands. King Leopold's rule of Belgian Congo also references red rubber, perhaps links to Congo. Red there. Thank you for that remark, Michaela. If you want to come up on screen and perhaps elaborate on that, you're most welcome to do so. For those of you that... Michaela?
Sorry. Yeah, no, sorry. I don't really have much to elaborate on. It was just something that struck me. Hanina, fantastic talk as always.
Thank you.
Yeah, it just made me think, Duan, of when you were talking about the aesthetics, the aesthetics of color photography and how that potentially links to this idea of extraction. So not literal extraction, as you mentioned, but rather this kind of tapping into a language of extraction or a visual language of extraction even. So yeah, so Silverman just in her interpretation of it used to be called, I think the RMCA, the Royal, was it the RMCA? Oh, sorry, I forget my acronyms. But the Interferon, the Royal Museum there, that was basically this fortress of celebrating King Leopold's reign in the Congo. And she kind of looks at the aesthetics of the Art Nouveau designs that literally look like whips, and how that there's also this kind of erasing of the violence that actually represents, and an extraction of this kind of beautiful, purely aesthetic, decorative aspect. So it just, yeah, it was definitely not a question, just a comment. Sorry about that.
No, I mean, I didn't know about the red rubber, but it's definitely something I will look into, because the history of individual pigments and dye stuff is rarely written, like per dye stuff. So I feel like also technical collections today, especially chemistry collections in former laboratories in German universities, like there is one at the TU Dresden, have a specific historical responsibility to kind of reconstruct and criticize the various ways in which each of these pigments and dye stuff and chemicals were framed, like through this extractive logic of colonialism, because it looks harmless. Like if you see it, and I've seen them, like it's a glass jar with a nice color in it, it has a vintage label, etc. But there is more to it than what reveals itself to the eye, that, you know, is worth mentioning. So thank you very much for your comment. I'm gonna look.
You're welcome. That idea of extraction also just reminds me, like when you were saying about the harmless labeling, if we think about how, for instance, vaccination against smallpox was occurring, I don't know so much about the African continent, but I know across India, they were actually using the lymph from children. So orphans would be used to kind of transport lymph. So the lymph would be used to inoculate other people from smallpox. And so again, like when you think about vaccination as this very kind of neutral, harmless endeavor, and then
here I am.
and then but then the story behind it is actually you have orphans who are, and this is obviously happening in the 19th century, but
I mean,
yeah, anyway, it's just something.
No, that is really interesting, because one of Fritsch's colleagues, Otto Finch, infected someone with leprosy in order to try medications on this person in Australia. So there is this entire history of taking liberties with people's bodies, especially as soon as you're out of Europe. Because Fritsch, as a doctor of medicine, knew that you could not tamper with people's dead bodies in Germany as you want, although he was a physician. But he felt like this is something he could get away with abroad, like in Australia. But when he got there, he knew that there were several hurdles of doing this transport of human remains from Australia to Berlin. So he had to corrupt, like bribe, a whole number of people in order to, well, be able to take his liberty with the cadaver and prepare the specimens and transport them. So there was this idea that I can just like bust into town and do what I want. But as soon as he was abroad, he realized that that wasn't the case. This is going to be a lot of hard work. So
there's an interesting story about the colonial periphery and the metropole, right? Like the trafficking in specimens and evidence, and especially with human remains and different ethical regimes that operated in different spaces. But it also depends on what period we're talking about, because you're dealing with Fritsch in the 19th century, like the early 19th century. Not the 19th century, the early 20th century versus the 19th century as well. Michaela, you had a point that you wanted to follow up on?
Sorry, no, I was just thinking, you know, Fritsch is coming from Germany and he's entering Australia, which is a British colony. And if, you know, you look at the kind of emphasis on British liberalism at the turn of, so the late 19th and early 20th century, and there's a lot of, yeah, so I'm wondering whether there's also a clash of colonial points of view. Where like where that kind of activity might have been, as someone coming with a kind of German background might have seen this as an acceptable practice, possibly, I don't know. But being in Australia or being in South Africa, that because of the supposed liberalism, with a big pinch of salt, that that the Brits were kind of espousing, that might have also shifted regulations that he had to kind of bypass. Because I know in Cape Town hospitals at the end of the 19th century, there was a lot of debate about pushing this kind of very, they framed it as non-racialism and universalism, and it was coming from a very British place. And so I wonder if there's possible, because it's a different empire, that there's potential conflict of points of view there.
No, I mean, this is definitely possible. And I'm working with the hypothesis, which is very likely, that he visited South Africa again in 1904, 1905. So, but I am drowning in archival documents while reconstructing this journey of his, like hundreds and hundreds of letters he sent in order to have access to what he wanted to have access to. The fact that he was confronted with laws and regulations of another empire, but also no doubt indigenous organization that very well understood what he was after and blocked him, is definitely possible. And this will be one of the things that I highlight in my research, also to go back to what Dwayne was saying, in order not to take him too seriously, because there was always resistance to these kinds of endeavors, to the stealing of human remains, to tampering with people's bodies. So I feel like in my research, it will be just as important to highlight the imperial limitation, the British imperial limitations on his work, as well as the possibilities of indigenous organization against him. So this is one point. And also, one of the things I wanted to say about Robert Lohmeyer, the photographer, and I told this story to Dwayne, and I will say it again. I don't know about recording this, but it's fine. I knew from his archives of the photographer that in order to create this image of the empty landscape, he literally needed to move people, like to get them out of streets. But in order to do that, people are not just gonna change their trajectories when going to work or home or doing whatever they want because, you know, he was in town and, you know, as a white German thinks he can tell them what to do. So people were not very willing to work with him. And he was upset because he wanted to blockade an entire street to take a photograph in Tanzania. And so he had to reach out to a colonial officer high up in colonial administration in Tanzania to write him a paper, giving him free access to pretty much the entire country and all the other German colonies, so that when he wants to take his photograph, he's not hindered by rules and regulations and other people, so that when he wants the street to be closed down, then it is closed down. So I knew about this letter and I hunted it down because I wanted to see what is in it. And I found out that it is at the Bundesarchiv, at the Federal Archives in Berlin. And so those of you who have done research in Germany, I get a heart attack whenever I know that a document is at the Federal Archives, because the odds of me getting my hands on it is like 0. But okay, so I sign up on the website of the Bundesarchiv, which is in and of itself hilarious because they don't have the country where I come from, Lebanon. Like they just have like European countries, and then they have Africa, and then like nothing else. So I'm like trying to find my own country and I couldn't. I'm like, okay. So I give like whatever BS answer that was possible. Like, oh, where do you come from? Other. I come from other. Okay. And I book an appointment like 3 months ahead of time. And then you need to do like 2 registrations, one on the appointment booking platform and one on the archival material platform, blah, 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 blah. So I do all of this and I send emails to make sure that everything is fine. And I call people and I mediate and I do all this work. And so on the fated date, I take this bus, well, like 3 buses because it broke down from where I live to the Federal Archives. And I get there, it's 30 degrees, I'm exhausted, etc. And I talk to the woman there. I'm like, hi, I ordered archival materials. My name is Hanin Hanoush, where are they? And she's like, we have nothing for you. Like, you didn't order anything. I'm like, what? Like, wow, I sent this email, I did this, I did that. I'm like, give me something like a microfilm, etc. Like, and then we have this altercation and she finally gets me a microfilm, the microfilm that I need. And I find this letter, like after waiting for 3 hours for it, while I'm sitting there at the Federal Archives. And it was such a bitter moment for me because I felt like I don't even have access to him having access. Like, not even that. which is like a metaphor for my entire research. Like, I don't have access to a white German photographer having access. Like, I am, yeah. And so this whole idea of the empty landscape, etc., just it gets on my nerves every time, especially because of this story that I wanted to share with you.
So who was the colonial officer that he wrote to, and do you want to let us in on the contents of the letter?
Well, he was a guy who signed his name as assessor or something. I still have to decipher the handwriting in it, but it says, like, I hereby demand that Dr. Robert Lohmeyer be given access in all the territories of the German Empire because he's doing an important endeavor for photographing and visually depicting the colonies. Please do not hinder his work in any way. If not, woe to you and your family, or something, with like a threatening kind of discourse.
Wow, so we have the synergy between imperial power and scientific practice, right? Like, and nothing should stand in the way of the practice of science. And then it troubles our understanding of science in that time as value free and neutral, right? Yeah.
It's not. I mean, it definitely wasn't. And I mean, you still had to come from a certain social class in order to study that kind of photography and be able to travel and have people give you what you want. And the photographer in question did come from a pretty upper class family, so he could walk into a colonial officer's office and be like, hey, give me a paper. Like, give me a paper, giving me access to the entire countries I need to visit. Come on. So you also have to get there as a photographer, because there were, of course, photographers in Germany who were like more working class or mid-class that didn't have this habitus and weight, who would have managed to succeed as much as he did.
Yeah, so he escalated it all the way up to the highest officials, and he felt comfortable enough to be able to do that. Like, those are the people that he was comfortable speaking to and addressing, and this was the kind of authority that he felt most comfortable exercising in doing his scientific work. I like the way
he
you
got
introduced
it.
that you have class there.
I mean, there's an interesting episode from his life in Berlin before he visited the colonies of the German Empire, where he was studying to be a photographer, but he was fooling around with the maid, whose name he doesn't mention in his archives, because she's just the maid, you know. And so they wanted to have a private time alone, not in his house, because she was working for him. And so he writes a letter to the director of the Zoologischer Garten in Berlin, like asking for access to the garden outside of closing time, in order for him to try his photographic material and do his photographs. But in fact, it's to be with this woman. And he got the access. So he could enter the Zoologischer Garten in Berlin after closing time. So he was used to kind of making these demands based on his entitlement. And the same thing happened when he was abroad, and it worked.
It sounds like there's another book there, Hanin, the private correspondences of and the other lives of of these scientists.
Yeah, why not?
Please, our audience members, I invite you to raise your hands if you have a question. You can come up on stage or drop a question in the chat box. I think there are many links, especially for historians that are working on South African histories, and if you're interested in links between Fritsch and Southern African and South African histories. I see a hand up, but for some reason I can't.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thanks, Dwayne, and thank you, Hanin, for the very informative talk. I'm just curious about if Fritsch had any responses. So his study into color photography was very clearly linked to three-color photography, but in the early 1900s, other color photography methods became available as well. Did he extend his research into any of those other methods as well? And did he assign the same value to those, if he did?
Very good question. No, he didn't. He was the he was the head of the Fotografische Vereinigung zu Berlin. So he protocoled a lot of their meetings in which these color processes, like the Lippmann process, like were discussed. But the only color photographic method he dabbled with was 3-color photography. I argue because it was the one that the German state was pushing for the most. Like, it was considered to be the German technology. So he was very much aware of all of the color processes taking place at the time that were heavily discussed, because they were discussed in his group, in the group that he directed. But he didn't try them. Only 3-color photography, and even within 3-color photography, he didn't produce that many images. Which is also why I feel like his engagement with it is not as serious as I had personally assumed when I first started my research. So he was very much aware, but this is the only one that he engaged with, or that he tried and instrumentalized the way he did.
Oh, thanks very much for your response. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions from our audience members? There are many, many links that we can draw.
Hi, Anine. Hi. Hi. I was just while I was looking at all these landscapes, I was just thinking of the links between the sublime and these landscapes, kind of the German sublime, and I know there's shifts in the ideas of nature in terms of those two things. But I was wondering if the photographs, they're landscapes, but you were saying they always had kind of architecture in there to show kind of the colonial imprint into nature. So were all the photographs kind of staged in terms of, you know, having a little bit of a building of some sorts within it, or yeah, I think, yeah, I don't really know what I'm asking, but I'm thinking about, I mean, the sublime was 18th century, so it's quite a bit before any of these photos, but links between those ideas of nature and how it was developed in Germany.
Yes, I mean, definitely the discourse around them is romantic, although the word sublime doesn't appear as such, but the impact of looking at these images on the body, like, you know, this hot nostalgia, like this life force, etc. So it was couched, I think, 3-color photography in more politically conservative terms, like with this vitalist approach to perception, like, oh, you look at it and you feel this and your body becomes this. So it's not so much the sublime that is outside of the perception of the viewer, but it's kind of how do you physically experience it as an embodied kind of image. But what is interesting about the way the photo books structure the motifs, or what is it that they're actually depicting, you of course have images of, let's say, a waterfall. There's nobody around it, like waterfall, like the Pangani waterfall in Tanzania, which was a site of local resistance to German colonialism, but you just see like a nice waterfall. Okay. And so you have these panoramas of landscape with like a church, like a German church, Western European architecture, kind of in the background. Like, it's not in the foreground because you need like palm trees and the beach and all of this, but it's in the background enough for you to see it, but it doesn't dominate the image. So there is this negotiation of distance between, oh, it looks different, look, palm trees, but it's familiar because you have a church, you have a German clubhouse, you have this, you have that. So it is a delicate kind of game that they're playing. But when it comes to the depiction of people, it's definitely exotic. Like, it's within this typical framework of exoticized women that are half naked, that they don't have a name, and like men, especially the Maasai fighters, because they were so important in German colonial history and considered to be like the supreme soldiers, etc. So they're donning their combat outfits, and it looks and it would look to the average German viewer at the time as very different from what they're used to. So when it comes to people, the photographer lays it thick on like exoticizing and eroticizing them. But when it comes to landscape, it's like a bit more flirtatious. Like it's different, but don't worry because there is a German institution there to protect you. So that's how I would read the photo books. But I mean, of
Thanks a
course,
lot.
just
Yeah.
if you look at the archives of Lohmeyer in Berlin, there's everything. Like there's everything. He took photographs of people on a coffee break at work, but this doesn't make it into the book. And I dream one day of an exhibition on colonial photography that just deals with the banal, like with the everyday. Because I mean, yeah, he was taking photographs everywhere he went. So he didn't just take the photos that ended up in the book. He took like over 300. The book has what, 100? So you have like women washing their clothes, you have men drinking coffee, you have children playing. You also have King Joya of Bamum, whom he might have met when he was in Bamum. So you have a lot of very different motifs that appear, but that don't really cater to this idea of the German colonies as a place that can be acclaimed and reclaimed. Because what are you going to communicate in terms of propaganda if you publish a photograph of workers having a coffee break? Like they're there, they're working, they have their lives, and you know, whether you bust into town or not, they don't really care because, you know, they're gonna keep on working. So I find this kind of difference between what was published and what was unpublished very fascinating, especially this like everyday, like the everyday life that he also captured, maybe despite himself.
Fascinating, these different perspectives that are portrayed through different media, right? And the photo books that you highlight, and the perspectives that they show of these officials and scientists working in these different regions, and the kinds of information they were meant to communicate, especially to a German audience back home, a middle-class German audience back home, also in the early 20th century. It's now 4:30. Anin, I want to say many thanks for a really rich and engaging talk. There's so much more that we can explore in terms of the traffic and circulation of knowledge between South Africa and the fascinating German scientists that you're working on, Gustav Fritsch especially. It was so enriching for me, and I'm pretty sure it was really enriching for our audience, and I hope it was enriching for you too.
Of course.
It's not a conversation that ends here today. We will continue to be sharing and trading information. Cycle to your email address. So for those of you who do want to be in touch with Anin, Anin has shared her email address with us. If there are any points of intersection or connections that you would like to follow up on, please follow Anin. Please, you can drop her an email, or more especially where a great intellectual community gathers is on
Twitter.
On Twitter, the Twitter platform, where Anin also has a very great and sterling presence among other German scholars as well. So many thanks for your talk, Anin.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I also want to thank our audience for visiting us this afternoon. For those of you, if it's your first time attending one of our Spirals talks, welcome. Please see our archive on the website of the Center for Curating the Archive. We have a number of other talks also by German scholars and artists who have come in to speak to us and to engage with us. You're welcome to see that back archive. We meet again at the end of August for another edition of Spirals, the title of which I don't know yet, but I will inform you soonest. So many thanks to you all for attending this afternoon. Many thanks again to Anin, and also to Nina Liebenberg for all her wonderful assistance with having this session this afternoon. We wish you a good weekend. Please stay safe. Thank you.